All right, welcome to Society and Culture in the American Colonies. We are going to focus more on the English colonies with looking at what does society look like. So let's go on. Now, when you look at the Spanish, the French, and the British within North America, this map is like awesome because it really shows you, of course, the red is Spain, and the green is France, and the orange are the British colonies. But as you can tell, they're all touching. They're all intermingling, which means their cultures are all being exposed, having contacts with the Native Americans and vice versa. So really what we're going to do first is look at the colonial population. So we're going to continue on to our next slide. So colonial life. There are various avenues, jobs, by looking at the end of colonial life, but in the beginnings of it, there's really not a lot. Really what I want to focus on is the indentured servitudes. And there's different expectations for different genders. And so when you look at men were supposed to receive clothing, tools, occasional land when freed. However, when they had served their 7 years, or however many they agreed to, most were left with nothing. And women were supposed to marry when they were done serving. However, if they're in their mid-20s, most of the time they would not be married. That was considered the age of a spinster, that you were past the age of marrying if you were not married by your mid to late 20s. And so many men were really the source of the social unrest because they couldn't find jobs, they weren't married, and they didn't positively add to society. Now, when you look at death and birth within New England, New England's population is going to quadruple in the second half of the 16th century. So we're talking about the 1650s to 1700. The population is having more children, and the lifespan is usually long. Now the expectancy of life is actually going to be lower in the South. It's around 40 years old, and my thinking is in the North it's colder, right? In the South it's warmer. Disease tends to run rampant and tends to spread in hotter climates. So I'm thinking that that's probably why the age expectancy is so much lower in the South. So let's look at medicine. What did medicine look like within the colonies? Now, women and babies did die in childbirth, or because of surgery, as doctors really did not know about sterilization or infections. And in fact, we don't really have our medical association within the United States. Isn't really created until 1900, 1901. So if you are a doctor in the colonies, you are really just learning from either reading books or watching other surgeries, but there's really a lot that they just don't know. So let's talk about women and families next within the colonies. So there are more men than women within the colonies, which is very interesting from my point. Women were typically married around age 20 or 21, and women were pregnant roughly every 2 years. And they usually had 8 children, and normally only 5 would reach maturity. And so the reason why families had a lot of children is that the hope was, well, at least a few will make it to adulthood. It's a very harsh reality for back then, and it's still a reality in some of the third world countries that are still today. But back in the colonies, this is why you had lots and lots of children. So let's talk about slavery in the early English America. So there's a demand for African servants to supplement the scarce southern labor force, simply because indentured servants, once they are freed, they don't need to work, right? And so it's really hard to keep workers in the South that are volunteers because of the heat and the extremes and just the needs within labor and what industries, for example. And so, in the mid-17th century, there's going to be a substantial commerce in slaves that are going to really be evident between the Caribbean islands and the southern colonies. Now, the demand for slave labor is going to increase with the transatlantic slave trade. Now, before we continue on, we're going to go to the next slide, which really explains it. Okay, it's the slide after this. So before we get to that slide, I wanted to show you this. This is a primary source, all right? This is an ad for slaves within the newspaper from the 17th century. It says, to be sold on the board of ship Bansian on Tuesday, the 6th of May next, at Alfie Ferry's choice cargo of about 250 fine, healthy Negroes, just arrived from the Windward and Rice Colft. The utmost care has already been taken and shall be continued to keep them free from the left danger of being infected with the smallpox, no boat having been on board, and all other communication with people from Charlestown prevented. Now I wanted to read that to you so that you can see just how nonchalant and how normal this is for this time period to have an ad for slaves. It's very interesting. And it really says a lot about the culture and the context from that time period. So let's continue on. So this is the transatlantic slave. So I wanted to show you this just so you can see these slaves that are particularly are going to be located within the Bahamas, within the Caribbean. So these slaves, some of them are taken to Europe, and some are going to be taken, the majority of them are going to be taken to the Bahamas, to the Caribbean, and then sent to North America. But as you can see, these slaves are, the Middle Passage is 1 to 3 months long. Now they were chained together, they were not on a cruise ship lounging and given adequate food and water. It was a very tough journey for 1 to 3 months. And that is just getting to the Caribbean. That is not even paying attention to the travels between the Caribbean to the colonies. So I wanted to show you this map just to show you just how involved this passage really was. So let's continue on. Now, as the slave trade grows, it's going to get more and more terrible. And by the 19th century, when it ends, it will be responsible for forcing the immigration of around 11 million Africans to North and South America and the Caribbean. Now, the Royal African Company of England is going to monopolize the trade. It's going to keep the prices high and the supplies low. And in 1697, the African slave trade is going to open to competition. Prices are going to fall and the number of Africans are going to greatly increase. And by 1700, there are roughly 25,000 African slaves in the English North America. And Africans are going to outnumber the Caucasian population. And by 1760, there is roughly around 250,000 Africans. And this is almost a little less than 100 years before the slave trade is exiled within North America. It's going to end a lot sooner within Europe. Now, we're going to continue to talk about slavery, but I wanted to show you these primary sources just so you could, we've already talked about the transatlantic passage, but I wanted to show you these pictures so you could see how these slaves were laid out. So this is the lower deck of the storage of 292 slaves. And as you can see, they're laying down. They're not standing. They would not be able to stand up because there's not enough room for them to stand up. They were typically chained together, for months. Now you can just imagine the smell from just pee and poop and dehydration and sweat, and it's crazy. And then this would be the top deck. They would try to isolate the men and the women, but that didn't happen all the time. This is a slave trader logbook. Now, a lot of times slaves more or less kept the same first name, but they would take on the last name of their owner. So if you had ancestors who were slaves and you were trying to track them down, or family members, say right after the Civil War when slavery was illegal, and you were trying to find family members, a lot of times you couldn't find them because their last names would change with every owner they had. But if you look at this logbook, I mean, that was centuries. This is centuries before the Civil War, that they would write them down as if they were property, because they really were within this context. Let's continue on. Now, the picture to the left is extremely famous when you think about slavery and what these men and women, boys and girls, children went through. This really just speaks volumes to what they went through. And the picture on the right speaks volumes as well to how they were treated and what was expected of them. Now, before we talk about the Great Awakening, I want to kind of talk about some of the economies of the South. We've already discussed tobacco, but we haven't discussed rice. Now, rice is particularly within South Carolina and Georgia, mostly because you need that wet climate to grow rice. And most African slaves, most of the population were African slaves because whites refused to work on rice plantations, and Africans were used to the same harsh weather conditions as within the Caribbean. Now, when you look at the northern economy and technological life, it's different. Now, within New York and Pennsylvania and Connecticut, you're going to have wheat, and you're also going to have the beginnings of the metal industry. And this is going to be in 1764, you're going to have a German ironmaster known as Peter Hans Clever in northern New Jersey. However, the colonies weren't really experiencing the industrial growth as England was because of English parliamentary regulations, such as the Iron Act of 1750, that restricted metal processing in the colonies. And so the largest restrictions on industry was the inadequate labor supply, a small domestic market, and inadequate transportation facilities and energy supplies. So in the mid-17th century, the fur trade is going to begin to decline, and lumbering, mining, and fishing is going to take its place. Now, when you talk about industry, you really need to talk about technology, or really lack thereof. Most farmers did not own a plow. Numerous households did not have pots and pans for cooking. Only half of the homes owned guns or rifles. People were too poor to afford them, honestly. And houses had few candles, few people had wagons, and the most common tool was actually the axe. And so when you think about perhaps those colonists who lived on the border of Native American land and colonist land, that's extremely nerve-wracking if you think the typical house did not have a shotgun, did not have any sort of weaponry to defend themselves but an axe. And here these Native Americans probably did. They did not have wagons so they could run away. It's very interesting to put that into context. So let's continue on and let's talk about the rise of colonial commerce. Okay, so the rise of trading among the colonies and the West Indies are typically known as the triangular trade. So you have merchants that are carrying rum and other goods from New England to Africa and exchanging merchandise for slaves who are then transported to the West Indies and then exchanged the slaves for sugar and molasses, which they shipped back to New England to distill into rum. So this is a huge effort. There's huge different commodities of trade. And you're going to have the rise of consumerism within the colonies because they're able to get these products. So as population grows, so did society, and the development of class divisions, such as the wealthy people in cities and towns who didn't have to manage large estates. People begin to advertise their merchandise in journals and newspapers. Items that were once considered luxury items are now very common, such as tea, household linens, glassware, manufactured cutlery, crockery, furniture. The colonists are really looking towards London fashion and education as their inspiration of how they want to live their life. So when you look at masters and slaves on plantations, plantation owners are really at the mercy of the market. When prices fall, they feel it as when the prices increase. So slaves are encouraged to marry, to develop a strong sense of family, of religion, and the religion is really a mix between Christianity and African folklore. Black house servants are being treated unfairly. Or kindly are really based on their masters. Now, most slaves are field hands. However, on larger plantations, they learn trades such as blacksmithing, carpentry, shoemaking, spinning, weaving, sewing, midwifery, and the list goes on. However, within patterns of society, there is a difference between the wealthy and the poor. You're going to see this exchanging ideas that were common amongst the rich to rich, but not from poor to rich. The wealthy are given the best seats in church. They speak a different language. They're referred to as ladies and gentlemen. They most likely live in cities and they participate in commerce. So there's various modes of society and culture that are beginning to surface within the colonies, since the colonies are starting to get older. And this is what brings us to the Great Awakening. So you're going to have really a pattern of religions or denominations that you're going to start to see within the colonies. Now, the Church of England is really going to be situated in Virginia, Maryland, New York, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Now, New Jersey and New York are going to have more Calvinistic ideas of religion because they're Dutch. Now, in New York, it's really interesting to point this out, that there's going to be around 2,000 Jews within New York, which is one of the largest areas of Judaism within the New World. People begin to be troubled about this decline of religion within society, because you have to remember that when the Puritans first came over, they built their society, their community around a church. The church was the center of the town, and they built houses and markets and whatnot based on where the church was located. And so in the 1730s and 1740s, this is really when the Great Awakening really resides. So most of the converts within the Great Awakening are going to be women, and they're going to have a particular appeal to women and the third and fourth set of settlers, because they wouldn't inherit land from their fathers, right? That would typically go to the first son, maybe the second son if their father was very wealthy or very smart with his money. Now, the Great Awakening is going to emphasize the potential for every person to break away from the constraints of the past and to start anew in his or her relationship with God, hitting on the desires of many people to break away from their families or communities and start a new life. Now, there's various powerful evangelists at this time. You have John and Charles Wesley, who will end up founding Methodism. You're going to have George Whitefield, which is the gentleman to the far right on this slide. And then you're going to have Jonathan Edwards, who is going to preach the traditional Puritan ideas of the absolute sovereignty of God, predestination, and salvation by God's grace alone. Now, the result of the Great Awakening is going to be the Enlightenment. which we are now going to end this lecture with discussing. So now we're going to look at the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is the product of scientific and intellectual discoveries in Europe in the 17th century that revealed the natural laws that regulated the workings of nature. So the Enlightenment celebrated the power of human reason and to argue that rational thought, not just religious faith, could create progress and advance knowledge in the world. So it created this encouragement towards people to look to themselves and their own intellect, not just God, for guidance on how to live their lives. So what they were thinking is that you don't just have this blind faith, but you use the faith that God has given you and the faith that you have, your Christian faith, and you use it alongside reason and come to a better conclusion than just faith alone. This is their idea, that you have that working hand in hand. You have your Christian belief along with human reason and thought. Now, some important people during this Enlightenment phase is going to be Francis Bacon and John Locke of England. You're going to have Baruch Spinoza of Amsterdam, and you're going to have René Descartes of France. And these are really the important aspects. These are the important men who are very boisterous during this time period, and they are very educated as well. Now, since we've talked about the Great Awakening, we've talked about the Enlightenment, we're really focusing on the educational aspects about where we are in the 17th century. So we really need to look at literacy. So by the time of the American Revolution, you're going to have half of all white men could read and write, which is incredible if you think about it. Mostly it was very wealthy individuals who could read and write, and that's not going to be the case. Families are going to have almanacs, which there are going to be dozens of them circling the colonies. The first printing press in the colonies is going to be operating in 1639. Education is going to be a huge importance. We're going to have the beginnings of schools. Massachusetts is going to be the first with a school in every town. Slaves typically didn't have the opportunity for education unless their master or master's wife taught them to read and write, which some did. You're also going to have universities start to pop up. These universities include Harvard, which was established in 1693 by a missionary who wanted to train ministers. You're going to have William and Mary in Virginia, established in 1693 as well. Yale is going to be established in Connecticut. The College of New Jersey, which is going to be later named Princeton, will be established in 1746. And these universities included the study of theology, logic, ethics, physics, geometry, rhetoric, Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. These colleges all started because they wanted to train missionaries or train ministers. It's very interesting that that was the beginnings of our educational system, was rooted within Christianity, within God, within Jesus. And I say this all because as we go from PowerPoint to PowerPoint, from lecture to lecture, we're looking at this overarching theme and this narrative of what does our early American history look like. And so just speaking from the last lecture to this one, you can see that really our initial focus was finding a place where we could worship freely. And as we have grown from the last PowerPoint to this one, we've roughly gone almost 2 centuries. You can see that we've started to branch out to see what kind of community do we want to have, what kind of culture, what kind of people do we want to be, what does our focus need to be or want to be. And at this time period, it's focused on religion and on Christianity and on Christ, and that's extremely lovely to see at this point in time within this culture and this context.